You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. Ladies and gentlemen, early season that makes official. Welcome to the big show. As always, the Chris Voss Show is family loves you, but doesn't judge you, at least not as harshly as your mother-in-law, because she wanted Mary Bob. Wow, I pulled the name there. That was a whatchamacallit. Anyway, guys, but the great thing about you, Bob, is, or Jane, or whatever the names we're using this week, just making up stuff in the ramble. You can watch the Chris Voss Show too and just become smarter. So refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, YouTube.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss, one on the TikTok, and Facebook.com/Chris Voss is the main place where you'll find our ilk and our videos and all the funny stuff that we do, and brilliance that shares the minds with you as well. Opinions expressed by guests on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the host or the Chris Voss Show. Some guests of the show may be advertising on the podcast, but it is not an endorsement or review of any kind. Today, as always, we have a brilliant mind in the show, and it's never me because I'm just an idiot host with a mic. We have Paul L. Nevins on the show with us today. He is an attorney, I should mention, as his title, and he has written a book that is out called Private Affluence and Public Squalor, Social Injustice and Economic Misery in America. I think you just described my bank account. The book is out May 23, 2024. We're going to get into some of the deets of him, and you can find out his valuable insights and everything he knows, or at least, what we can squeeze into a half an hour. Paul L. Nevins has been a trial attorney in private practice since 1982. He is admitted to being in the Massachusetts bar. Did I say that rightly? No, I had some fun with it. He's been in the federal court for Massachusetts and First Circuit Court of Appeals. He is a member of the Massachusetts Bar Association and the National Employment Lawyers Association. He's also a member of the American Bar Association and served on its National Advisory Committee. Although a sole practitioner, he's been involved in extensive, complex civil cases through his legal career, and in most cases, he has prosecuted claims as a plaintiff's attorney on behalf of employees who have been victims of age, sex, race, disability discrimination, etc. Early in his career, he represented the prevailing plaintiff in Denton versus Boilermakers Union and a race discrimination case, which Judge Wolf found a continuing civil rights violation that permitted the plaintiff to roll back his statute of limitations with respect to damages. That's hard to do, folks, if you don't understand that legalese. Once you pass that statute of limitations, it's hard to get that. But if you've been bad, the courts punish you. Or at least usually that's the idea and concept. O.J. Simpson withstanding. Anyway, welcome to the show, Paul. How are you?
Thank you. Very well.
Did you get the joke that I said that you admitted being in the bar? It says you were admitted to the bar.
I got that, yes.
I had some fun with that.
Remember Shakespeare said first kill all the lawyers, but he meant that actually as a compliment.
Did he ever study law? Like, why did he have that? Why was he scarred that way? Did someone hurt him?
It was satirical. The thought back then was that if anybody could oppose the British monarchy, at least it would be lawyers, he hoped.
Yeah. No one thinks attorneys are important until they need one. Isn't that
I agree.
What the saying goes? But I love law and I love attorneys as long as they're not, suing me, the ones suing me. But I've learned a lot from them. And law is important in our world. Give us your .coms so people can find you on the interweb, sir. Give me your .coms, your websites, wherever you want people to look you up on the internet.
Private Affluence and publicsqualor.com.
So give us a 30,000 overview of what's in this book, Private Affluence.
Aside from being a lawyer, I've obviously, like many lawyers, I'm a disappointed academic. I actually started graduate work at NYU, finished a master's there. It was in a doctoral program, but it was interrupted by the Vietnam War. And when I returned to a doctoral program, it was pretty clear that most of my colleagues were teaching part-time adjunct faculty. There weren't any jobs in the academy. So I changed careers. I immediately became a teacher of the Boston Public Schools for 12 years and was active in the Boston Teachers Union, AFT-AFL-CIO. and went through all the race wars, busing, desegregation, chaired their desegregation committee. And then, given those experiences, I thought it was time to change careers. So I enrolled at Suffolk University Law School and became an attorney.
Mm-hmm. What made you want to do that? What was it that drew you to that profession?
I mean, I came out of a working class family, and my father actually was a Boston cop, grammar school graduate, but if he told me if he had ever had a choice, he would have preferred to be somebody like Perry Mason and would have preferred to be a criminal defense attorney.
Yeah.
That kind of inspired me, but also, coming out of the background in which I was raised in Boston, I had a certain commitment to social justice, though. I thought the legal career would be an opportunity for me, especially after being taught 12 years, to make a difference.
Was there, and I know you kind of answered my question, but I want to dig it just a little bit more. Sometimes there's a crisis moment, or there's a moment where attorneys experience the law in action, or maybe they see something or experience something that interferes with rights, and it kind of gives them this kind of fire to go, I see why this is important and I want to pursue this. Was there any sort of a moment like that for you?
Yeah, there were a number. Initially I began because I needed trial experience as a criminal defense attorney. So I represent a number of minorities and basically poor people who needed court-appointed attorneys. And it was pretty clear to me that in a lot of respects, the playing field was heavily tilted against them, no matter who they were. Mm-hmm. And some of them had very legitimate defenses, and some also had, been treated very badly on the civil side. That inspired me. Coming out of my union background also, I was very determined to pursue a concentration in employment law litigation, because I thought that, individuals in our culture, particularly those in protected classes, for example, age, I think it's always been a very significant problem in our culture. Mm-hmm. A tremendous number of people who are older, we get over 40 in our culture, many are told, you're too old, you can't learn new tricks, you need to go on. And these are people who are often displaced if they lose their jobs between 40 and 65, for example. Yeah. There are many dead meat. I mean, they can't qualify for Social Security. If they're not disabled, they have nothing else. And they are reduced to menial jobs in our economy. That was kind of an inspiration for me. I had a lot of age discrimination cases as well as some race discrimination cases.
And, you and I are both old dudes. We got a lot of experience under our belt. I imagine some of those civil rights and things were a lot of that what you were seeing maybe back in the eras of the days when civil rights were still being really fought. I think they're still being fought today. I don't mean to be dismissive of that, but there was kind of a lot of Martin Luther King and things going on back in those days, and race riots, and people trying to resolve these issues.
There absolutely were, and I strongly supported civil rights, but I had an interesting glitch also. As I was in law school, still teaching, we had, as a result of desegregation, as I said, I'd been very extensively involved in chairing the Boston Teachers Union's desegregation committee. The Judge Garrity was hearing the Boston desegregation case, and I always thought, as a kind of white working class guy, that desegregation was badly mangled, and it went back to decisions by the Berger Court, the United States Supreme Court, the Milliken 1 and Milliken 2, that basically said, if there's a problem of segregation, it's the city itself and the surrounding suburbs are not responsible and liable. Garrity imposed an order in Boston that basically pitted working class whites against working class blacks, which I thought was a recipe for disaster. And I said so on a number of occasions. Ironically, in 1982, as I'm getting ready to graduate from law school, I'm still teaching at the time, the city of Boston told the federal court they were suffering a budget shortfall. I said, no, that's nonsense. That's not happening. But no one ever investigated it. So Garrity then handed down an affirmative action hiring order. I was one of 710 white teachers who were hired in the 1960s, 70s. We were, basically very progressive people, and all of us were laid off. I ultimately got my job back, but I was reminded that, sometimes these remedies are heavy-handed and they hurt the wrong people. And I think that was one of the kind of dividers that is pitted in our culture right now, working class whites against working class blacks and others, which I think is very unfortunate.
Yeah. We've had Ed Glaude Jr. was on the show with us today. He wrote about Baldwin. We talked about, what a lot of James Baldwin, I should say, talked about back then, and how it's interesting. We're still having the same conversation. We're trying to resolve in a positive way, or argue in a way for some people. But yeah, I'm disappointed. I had always hoped, like when we elected Obama, that maybe that would help. But systematic racism is endemic in every feature and level of society. Discrimination, sexual, race. I think our biggest problem is we have these things called human beings running around, and they're horrible people for the most part. Not always, but if we could just get rid of them, we might have some peace around here.
We might, and I think the issue we've never been able to face is that, right, race is endemic in our culture, and it's always been an issue. And, the debates when Harris is running against Trump and so on, the question always became clear. Is it ever possible for a woman or a black, no matter how well qualified they are, to possibly prevail? Hillary Clinton also. The answer probably is no, because a lot of people don't want to admit, their really undisclosed bias or sometimes unconscious bias. I know as a trial attorney, one of the things we've always insisted juries be polled on, and also highly look at some videos in terms of unconscious bias, because it's a real problem for all of us. We know you have to go back and, what's going on here? Is there something I don't understand or something I'm missing?
Yeah, it's interesting where we're at. Now, the title of your book, Private Affluence and Public Squalor, Social Injustice and Economic Misery, does this still fit? I want to make sure. I kind of went off on a tangent because I try and plumb the book first, but is this fitting into the narrative that's inside the book that we've been talking about so far?
It kind of does. I mean, the title actually comes from John Kenneth Galbraith, who back in the 50s wrote a title book, The Affluent Society. And he bemoaned the existence at that time of what he saw as increasing squalor in the public sector. But so what I've been able to trace through my career is that our economic system has continued to change drastically. And in my book, I allege for the worse, because unfortunately, our system hasn't regulated antitrust, monopolies, oligopolies, and fewer people have amassed enormous amounts of wealth. One point I make, for example, in my book is that, I'll just quote from it, that in 2021, the top 1% of Americans had a combined net worth of $34.2 trillion, 30.4% of all household wealth in the United States. The bottom 50% of the population held a mere $2.1 trillion combined, or 1.9% of all wealth. So that's a pretty startling statistic. And there's another one that basically goes back to 2014. It's been updated. Back in 2014, the top 25 hedge fund managers in the United States earned more than all kindergarten teachers in the United States. My contention is that if we're going to really look at polarization, one of the things we have to look at is this huge economic divide, because it's pitted hardscrabble whites against hardscrabble blacks and everybody else. And we're all trying to stay afloat, but the difficulty is becoming greater and greater. All of us with children realize, grandchildren, that their prospects aren't as sanguine as when you and I were youngsters.
Yeah. It's interesting how we kind of hit this peak moment, and it was a very short peak moment. It was actually, there was actually a lot of anomalies that were attached to it. GIs returning from home with huge amounts of savings, house buying assistance, and rightly, they put their lives on the line. And then, of course, this sudden sort of Levittown expansion, suburban pavement of America that kind of came from all that. And it really was a post-war anomaly that flooded the savings of all that time into the thing. And suddenly everyone had, 2 cars, 2-car garage, the picket fence, yada, 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 this perfect life. And I think there's some incorrect data on how long that lasted. Some people think it lasted for a long time, and I think it was a blurb on the screen. But people got attached to that, and it seemed to get taken away from them over the challenges that came after that, and some of the economic issues, and seeing the world suddenly turn global as opposed to just America being the ruling class in the world.
And I think you put your finger on those important issues. Certainly. One of the issues was that I don't want to blame the University of Chicago, but I will, the School of Economics and Law, which basically said that the antitrust doesn't need to be regulated. It's fine, and vertical monopolies not going to hurt anyone. And I think that's been disproven by all the data. But the other part, I think, is globalization. We've all heard, the term the world is flat and so forth. Part of the problem was, you go back to Reagan and then Clinton, when Dick Gephardt was Speaker of the House, he felt very strongly when NAFTA was being negotiated. Yeah. It was necessary to have some fair reciprocal trade agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And that power was really lost. So we opened up GATT and everything else to a variety of countries, including China, without any attempt to say, wait a minute, we're going to have at least a level playing field where, we're not suffering the disadvantage. And that never happened. And, although I may disagree with President Trump, he's right about issues. When we look at Europe, for example, they've got a VAT tax. So they impose that 20% tax on any automobiles imported to Europe. So there were no Fords or no Buicks or no Lincolns driving around Europe. We don't have, that kind of punitive, we hadn't had that kind of punitive tax. So it created a very unlevel playing field.
Yeah. And we've done the same too. I mean, I think Biden imposed the ban on the Chinese electric cars, which are far better than our American cars and have far better features and are far cheaper. If you've seen the BYD cars, there's the brand BYD and other electric cars, like they can jump. They can literally jump the car. The car can do a bunny hop, filled with features and stuff. So we've all kind of been in this game mode of, protecting our localized geographical industries. Yeah. I would give you that there's a resonance that goes farther back that's led to a lot of these injustices and economic issues that go back to the liberalism of Reagan. And a lot of that comes actually out of Nixon and Johnson. A lot of this is founded from Johnson flipping unions to the Democrats by signing all that legislation that helped poor people. And literally they flipped from being the Republicans and being someone who didn't support black people to a party that flipped and did, which left a chasm with the Nixon era and the Republicans because they lost all the unions. And so then Nixon had to come up with a Great Southern Strategy. They, of course, attacked colleges. Same thing with Reagan because of the war. Yeah. And so a lot of this economic down, I'm still waiting for my check from Reagan on those trickle down economics.
You're never going to get it.
Should be here any day now. I'm holding my breath. But and so you can kind of see a lot of the patterns that come from the origin of some of this stuff.
Yeah. When I was we had a Republican senator here, Lever Salzstall, father after his family, but he received significant labor union support because, in fact, he strongly supported unions. One of the other trends that I talk about in my book, which I think is relevant in terms of our recent economic history too, was the passage of Taft-Hartley back in 1947. Harry Truman vetoed it. It was passed overwhelmingly by a new Republican Congress. And what that did was it totally deindustrialized the North. The northern industries, the Rust Belt developed, and all those industries migrated to the South. They opened up right to workshops, which decimated unions. But the other thing that entrepreneurs discovered with that is if they could move to the South and successfully evade unions, they could do even better ultimately if they moved to the third world that have no regulation whatsoever. Yeah. And in fact, that's where we ended up.
Yeah. Reagan's idea was to break the unions, which were funding the Democrats, by moving jobs overseas. So he came and said, hey, we'll make it easier for you to move overseas. We'll break the unions. You won't have to deal with unions overseas. And then we can keep getting elected. I've been a Republican, full disclosure, I've been a Republican. I've been a Democrat. Now I'm a uncommitted voter. What's it called? I've seen all sides. I'm an independent voter. I think that's the way it is. But, I'm critical of everyone I vote for. In fact, I'm overly critical.
Well, I am also. I think it's healthy.
Yeah, it's very healthy. Please do that, Americans. It's not a football team. We all die. We're all right in the same lifeboat. So if you punch holes in it, we're all going to sink together, which is what's happened. So you ask a lot of questions in the book. What are the values Americans collectively hold that are destroying the American dream? What do we as citizens of the United States believe with each other as citizens? I think that comment I made about the boat is important. I often say on the show, my quote, we are all stewards of democracy. It is up to each one of us. And it's not just about the vote. It's about every day. You need to read the paper. You need to hold politicians accountable. You need to, when they lie, when they cheat, when they steal, you need to hold them accountable. Like I said, I'm abusive almost to a level of anybody I've ever voted for. About half the time I'm going, okay, I approve of what you did there. Could have been better, but I understand we got to make compromises. And then the other half of the time I'm like, you idiot. So I'm not in any cults. There's some other questions you asked. What is the purpose of government? What is the role of private enterprise? What is the meaning of equal opportunity, public interest, et cetera, et cetera? I'm just kind of throwing those out if you want to pick up on any and tease them out a little bit for people to buy the book.
I think one of the interesting issues we have is how we identify ourselves. It has to do with the issue of values. I mean, we have, for example, watching, for example, current inhabitants of the White House and the supporters, they basically describe themselves as conservatives. And Reagan's people describe themselves as conservatives. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason they do so is it's a lack of understanding of labels. And I think labels are kind of important because you can't understand who we are unless we know where we came from. We are a liberal democracy by definition. So we don't have, by definition, conservatives in this culture. We might have liberals who feel the country's going in the wrong direction or whatever, but they're not conservatives. Conservatism goes back to the ancient Greeks. And if we want to find out where conservatism exists today, it's in the Vatican. It's in Catholic social teaching, which when many Americans read it, they say, God, that's really radical. How could they do that? It's not radical. A conservative is communitarian. We're basically emphasized we're all part of one, a body politic. We owe to one another. By contrast, liberalism says in its coarsest form, each of us is an individual, separate atom, and we compete against one another, and society is purely contractual. And if we don't like it, we can walk away. And that's not a prescription for a healthy society. So that's part of what I address the issue of values. Mm-hmm. If you want to find conservatives, you go to the Vatican, you look at Catholic social teaching. If you do want to be able to contrast it to them, then you could look at, by another example, contrast is European social democracy, which was also a reaction against liberal culture. And they came up with a different prescription, but it was communitarian also. In fact, one thing you find is both Catholic social teaching and social democratic teaching they share pretty similar critiques of unbridled market capitalism. I mean, I don't think anybody today in the world stands up and says we should have a top-down command economy like China. But people realize there's got to be some kind of regulation. I often quote Elizabeth Warren, who basically has said, as a capitalist supporter, that capitalist regulation is theft. And sometimes we think we see that, especially looking at cryptocurrency right now, for example, what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, and oligarchy, we're seeing some interesting patterns in our government. I think we have more billionaires running in government right now than ever before. I'm sure that's a fact. Yep. And, we've had a lot of people on the show that have written about Russia, the oligarchy, how it developed, how the kleptocracy works, where Putin hides his money and places the billionaires, and they basically control the country, steal all the wealth, and you're in bread lines, and I don't know. Right now, ships are coming from China, so I'm getting ready for the Maduro diet and bread lines. Half a joke, not half a joke. Yeah. But what I like about your book, and when I look at the questions that are provided and some of the details that I'm seeing, is this is a conversation that we used to teach people in school called civics. Yeah. And these used to be, I was taught civics in school. I'm sure you probably were too. But this was one of the things that was dumped on the agenda. I'm not going to point fingers at Republicans, that to destroy school and education, number one, so they could create religious schools. That's and part of it was because of Brown versus Wade. A lot of people don't understand that school vouchers are about racism. People don't want their kids going to school with mixed race. So they've been pushing this. You just saw SCOTUS had the case before to make the first publicly funded with public funds private religious school. And there's been this push to theocracy when you understand certain billionaires like Betsy DeVos and her father from the Nixon administration, and what they do with the Center for National Policy, and what they do when they write them in the Heritage Foundation for Fox News, the scripts of right-wing media. You kind of understand the hidden hand of what they're in there. And a lot of them really want a theocracy. They don't believe, this is why they want 10 commandments on courthouse steps. They want an American ISIS where there is no constitution. There is the Bible and the 10 commandments, and you live and die by that, and they're punished it in court. That's their utopia that they want. And they pushed it. You've seen it. You've seen the judges they put into SCOTUS, and it's kind of interesting how that's playing out right now, because they're doing some things I didn't expect from some of them. But, if you buy an RV for them, I guess you can get whatever SCOTUS ruling you want. Anyway, that's a joke of the one gentleman there on the SCOTUS board. But I like how you're bringing this to the thing, because this used to be a narrative we had in schools, and we don't have the civics class.
In fact, I have an entire chapter in the book on the decline of civic education. We look at the data in terms of Americans, what they can, well, we could begin with lots of things like literacy levels. The majority of Americans could not read the New York Times because it's above their, it's written at 10th grade UNESCO level. It's too complicated for them. Huge number of Americans can't name more than one or two justices in the Supreme Court. You question them on a whole variety of issues in terms of Congress, Article 1, Executive Article 2, Judiciary Article 3. They have no answers. They don't understand. And you're absolutely right. I mean, when I went to high school in the 60s, we had robust, not only American history, but principles of democracy, civic education courses. And we debated all those issues and we learned them. And I think to the extent to which we've gone to vouchers and tried to move away from public education, it's hurt all of us. I think the other thing that has hurt our culture is we really don't have any shared sacrifice any longer. So I was not happy about being conscripted into the military out of graduate school. But, I adjusted to the Army. But the one thing I realized was once we got rid of that, the Pentagon was quite happy, as was the welfare through warfare industry, because once the military became entirely volunteer, out of sight, out of mind. We could wage wars forever. Nobody's sharing the sacrifice, and we have no control over that. And now we read some of the data where a lot of young people interviewed said if conscription were reintroduced and you were given a choice, Peace Corps, Army, whatever, what would you do? I'd leave the country. That's a pretty bad reflection.
Yeah, you'd have the college campuses rioting and all the stuff you saw during the Nixon administration. I think you saw some pushback during Desert War, and even the private military. Bush with Iraq and Afghanistan, created this whole private military with President Cheney from Halliburton filling their pockets. I love how an ex-CEO of Halliburton leaves Halliburton and then enriches Halliburton and then goes back to them. What a concept. It's almost like it might be happening today. Anyway, Bitcoin. Anyway, you talk about a lot of these things, and I think it's real important. Can we touch a little bit and tease out on your book, The Politics of Selfishness? Because somehow in 2025, kind of feeling like some of that might be going on as well. It'd be pertinent.
Well, that basically, critics who disagree with me basically, you're blaming all the travail in the United States on John Locke. I said, no, it's the interpretation of John Locke's philosophy of individualism, which was incorporated into our Constitution.
Is that rugged individualism? Was that the quote or the reference, if I recall?
Yeah, the politics of selfishness. So basically the argument was that John Locke's philosophy in England was an attempt to counter the power of the monarchy and after the Glorious Revolution. So the issue there was that it was still based and rooted in a communitarian tradition that came out of the Middle Ages. So it was nuanced. In the United States, it became kind of taken over in whole cloth and adopted and really kind of metastasized into this philosophy of rugged individualism. We don't have any controls. We can do whatever we want. And, I suggested back when I wrote that's the root of part of our political paralysis, that we can't work in concert together because we're constantly fighting one another. It's a war of every man against every man. Quote Locke's predecessor, Thomas Hobbes.
And I know this from being a Republican, because during that age, there was always this, we need to just have people have rugged individualism. Yeah. And, you need to, everybody pulls their stuff up with their bruceps. And I was a Republican saying the same thing because I grew up poor. I started businesses and then became, wealthy. And even by today's means. And so I was like, I did it so everyone else can. I'm voting for George Bush. Yeah. And what I didn't, I was kind of in my own bubble because I live in my own private Idaho, Utah, where 97% of people are white. And I hadn't been exposed to in my life. I grew up in California. I was exposed to everyone in California. I was friends with everyone. So I didn't get that racist sort of element. I lived in the melting pot of people. That's healthy. But so I didn't have a lot of experience in seeing how a lot of poor people lived, a lot of people that either had made bad choices in life and shouldn't suffer indefinitely for them. I mean, that's the reason we have a bankruptcy court, is so that people can start over. We can't throw them away, welfare and all those sort of things. And so I kind of bought into that rugged individualism. I'm like, if I can do it, because I'm a stupid kid and still am stupid. If I can do it, somebody else can. But not everyone has the same opportunities. Not everyone has the same. I certainly, had my fair share of people who tried to help me back, but I certainly didn't have any sort of race discrimination that was holding me back and sabotaging me. The indemnification of racism and civil stuff, it's so deep into American culture. We're separated by freeways and subdivisions that were redlined by banks, and it's just all this stuff that's created a mess. Even religion was separated. Martin Luther King famously said, we can't even pray together on Sunday as white people. And so there's a lot of this, and I was lucky enough that 9/11 made me wake up and go, why do people in the world hate us? I had this panacea idea or utopian idea that America's great and everyone loves us and we're just so cool. And then I'm like, why are they flying shit into our buildings and stuff? We're that cool. I thought we were the cool kids on the block, but evidently people hate us, and why? And so then I started studying the world. I started studying nature and trying to understand why human beings were, the way they were. And it opened up my worldview, and it got me away from that whole concept that, there are people that grow up poor and in discrimination, and it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to get out of slums. It's hard to get in, not slums, but, places that are largely poor. There's no jobs, there's no support, no education. You're really subject. What's the word I'm looking for? You're really sabotaged from all different levels. And every time you try and get up or out, you could be attacked, and there's you get pulled over for so your turn signal doesn't work right or something, and then off you go, and we fill the jails. A lot of that came from the liberalism of Reagan. First thing he did when he came into office is he took away all the support welfare systems and increased the police. And then of course Clinton didn't help. We're bashing both Democrats and Republicans here, people. Clinton didn't help by, making the 3 strikes law, I think it was, or something, or whatever that enactment was that really created the megaplex of the industrial prison complex we have in America. Yeah.
I think in terms of, the whole issue of rugged individuals, most of us think back who, survived relatively well in life. Along the way, one or two people helped us, gave us a leg up.
Yeah.
And that became critical. And I can think back even to my, high school education, a couple of people came to my aid and so forth. They were invaluable. And back to,
as we round out the show, this has been a great discussion. I could sit and talk with you for hours on this. I love your insights. And this is something a lot of young people should be aware of. You can't fix what's going on now unless you look at the history and understand it. And then from there, you can map forward. And, you can't fix something if you don't take for it. There's a saying I always say in the show from my quote, the one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history. And thereby we go round and round. So we got to learn from our history. And it's important that you're asking these questions because these aren't seated in education nowadays with an intent for that to know. Because if you don't understand the value of law, your rights, the rule of law, the Constitution, it's easier to dominate you and turn you into oligarchy. That explains the Elon Musk thing. So we round out the show. Anything more you want to promote? To any consulting or hiring you as an attorney, future books, things of that nature, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I just, I do think that, the issue of inequality is a major one in our culture that has to be discussed.
Mm-hmm. And
the other thing, from my experience as an attorney, issues of discrimination in our culture, they're pretty pervasive and they're often unconscious. And, my 43 years, it wasn't just discrimination itself that became an issue, but what I discovered was that how people were treated in terms of protocols, things that were supposed to be followed, generally evaded. And I had a number of cases where we couldn't prove the underlying claim of race discrimination or age discrimination. But what we could show is of the 42 protocols the employer mandated and published, they failed to follow any one of them. And that suggested they were arbitrary and capricious. And I think that raised the whole issue of fair treatment, how we treat one another as a society. It's an issue we really have to engage in.
And I like your concept that we all, we're all in the same boat together on this. We've all rise or fall together. We're Americans. The person who's supposed to be our president is supposed to have the interests of all of us and lift the American ideal and what America has been about for the last 80 years, a shining beacon on the hill. I really shouldn't use that because that's actually not a good reference. That's a Reagan and religious reference.
I agree.
But being this beacon of freedom, free speech, democracy, and engendering those ideals, let's put it that way, and being a leader in the world as opposed to a follower. I think that's...
Well, so we worry now that given what's going on in terms of tariffs and sanctions and attacks on Harvard, other universities, research, a lot of young people, particularly in the Boston area where I obviously live in the city, they're going to be migrating to Europe. I mean, I can't see a lot of them migrating to China for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But I could see a large number of them migrating to Canada or to Europe. And one of the final comments I think I'd leave everybody with is we seem to forget that in Germany, after that country was united by Otto von Bismarck from roughly 1875, even through World War I up through the Weimar Republic, Germany was one of the leading countries in the world in terms of medical research, scientific research, and a whole variety of other issues. Once Hitler came to power and the events that subsequently occurred, German's intellectual propriety was absolutely destroyed, and they've never recovered in that respect. And I'm deeply concerned that could happen here to the United States.
Yeah. I mean, that's usually what happens with nationalism. We kind of, we went through nationalism back under early FDR. And, the thing was, we don't want to get sucked into Europe's war because we didn't like the first one and it didn't turn out well. And by doing that, it increased the level of costs that it took to fight that war and defend democracy, because we were next up on the docket. And we found that out with Pearl Harbor. And of course, the Atlantic Ocean was starting to fill with Hitler's submarines. So it was making trade even harder. We were up next on the plate. And, you think of all the men and women that died in World War II that didn't have to if we would have went after Hitler as soon as he invaded Poland.
We see that today, I think, unfortunately, with Ukraine and Europe.
Yeah, I just watched the minister, whatever the title
is. Oh, yeah,
the
president.
He was just talking about how he's seeing buildup on their border of Russia. And Russia, Russia's just playing games where they're just like, oh, yeah, we want peace. We're willing to, stop bombing. And then they're bombing more than they ever have. And anybody who grew up with Russia, you grew up with Russia, I grew up, hiding under desks, under bomb threats of nuclear war, that somehow that steel case desk of lead would somehow save me from a nuclear war. I don't know what, there was kind of interesting Fight Club scene there of
the Finns are interesting too, because they were neutered by the Russians. They fought them hard. They had to surrender some of their territory.
Yeah.
But they've learned, and they understand who the Russians are. And I think maybe one interesting glitch with the president of Finland is apparently he's an incredibly accomplished golfer. And he's been able to strike up a friendship with Trump. And maybe that will help. But God knows, if we don't pay attention to those issues also, we're going to repeat, it's Santayana who said, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think that's unfortunately true.
That may be why I built that quote off of that I made, where I may have modified it off that, where, the one thing man can learn from his history is a man never learns from his history. I mean, this is why we talk about these things. This is why you're asking the questions, your book. So wonderful discussion. We could go on an hour for us. And I love having this discussion with you. And I hope our audience does too, because you're going to learn a lot, and we need to think about these things. And they're prescient in determining the future and success. I don't have children, but people that have children and grandchildren want to see them succeed. These are important questions for them too. Give us your .com so people can find you on the interwebs. Give me your .com, your website, so people can find you on the interwebs.
Private Affluence and publicsqualor.com.
Thank you for coming on the show, Paul. I love these conversations. They're brilliant. They're in depth.
And I enjoyed the conversation. I wish you the best of luck in your program also.
I'm going to need it in 2025.
Competition, but it's very good.
Yeah. Hopefully we've been
and ask a lot of questions
and educate a lot. That's what we try and do. Share the wealth of knowledge. So share the wealth of knowledge, folks. Pick up Paul's book, Private Affluence and Public Squalor, Social Injustice and Economic Misery in America. which I think describes my checking account. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad. It's actually pretty good. Anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com for just Chris Voss.
Thank you.
LinkedIn.com for just Chris Voss. Chris Voss, one, the TikTok, and all those crazy places on the internet. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
And that's just out, Paul.